Hello, everyone. Welcome to my Form 3 religion class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. Today we're going to be taking a look at Proslogion, Chapter 1, the introduction to one of St. Anselm's most famous works. I don't typically record videos for my Form 3 students because, thanks to the way I was taught in college, I really like to spend most of our time in class grappling with texts for the first time without giving them a lot of information up front. But in this case, I thought it would be good to go back and create a video after we'd gone over some of the material to bring a few things together as a quick review and to cover some of the material we didn't get to in class. So this video will be a little bit different, skimming over some things, looking a little more closely at others. So let's get to it. Here's a basic outline of the chapter. It's very short. It's about front and back of a sheet of paper, depending on how you format it, obviously. And those 7 paragraphs, although my students tend to be a little challenged by the poetic nature, the writing style of it, it's actually very tightly organized with really nice progression. And a lot of this video is just meant to show that. So we have 7 paragraphs, and in the first one, St. Anselm exhorts the reader to find God in prayer, to contemplate God. Immediately after that, he spends really the bulk of the chapter talking about reasons that can't be done. And we're going to obviously have to spend a good bit of time on that. So paragraphs 2, 3, 4, and 5, all looking at the difficulties, or in fact the impossibilities of doing this thing. Then we turn in the last 2 paragraphs to Anselm asking for God to fix this problem, asking for mercy, asking for help. Although the way he does that is a little strange. And then finally, we get an extremely famous culmination, not just in the work of St. Anselm, but really for the whole Catholic tradition, where we talk about Fides, Quaerens, Intellectum, faith as the solution to this problem and how it is a starting point for our seeing God and reaching the very meaning of our lives. So here's the first paragraph, and I use this every year as my introduction to how to summarize text. In fact, that's what this whole reading is for. I try to get my students to convert these paragraphs into 5 or 10 word condensed summaries. And I've mapped some of that on the screen here. We've got a pretty interesting set of constructions to start, a little quadruplet of parallel statements where we're fleeing, hiding, casting aside, and putting away as our verbs. And then collectively, these nouns or noun phrases, they're all meant to somehow convey the same thing. Occupations, disturbing thoughts, burdensome cares, toilsome business. In class, we discussed this as the really famous notion in our tradition of renouncing the world. The world, following the evangelist St. John, is, in the Catholic tradition, a common way of trying to describe our daily life, all that stands between us and talking to God, and interacting with God, seeing God, union with God. Obviously, we're not talking about the world as an artifact, as an item in astronomy or geology. We're not trying to talk about it in that sense. It's more like pressing pause on your daily life, your routine, all of the ways the world gets in the way. And these verbs of fleeing and hiding and casting aside and putting away, we summarize as renouncing. Anselm's actually a little bit unclear on whether or not that renunciation is brief, temporary, or if we mean a lifetime. It is worth remembering that he is a Benedictine. He's actually an abbot when he writes this, abbot of a monastery. So the Benedictine way is, in some sense, to do this for the rest of your life. But even there, even in the monastery, you find occupations and thoughts and cares and business, all of which are a distraction from prayer, all of which are a distraction from the contemplation of God. And so whether you've devoted your entire life to renouncing the world, or it's what you're going to do for your morning prayers and your evening prayers and the times that you do contemplate God at home, it's something that must be done actively. At the center of the paragraph, we've got this nice expression, entering the inner chamber of the mind, which I think is the centerpiece of the paragraph. And this having the key idea or the key phrase in the center of every paragraph, if the center of the paragraph, is going to be a pattern for the rest of the work, especially in these next few paragraphs. But what we're describing here is some form of prayer, resting in God, entering into your mind, thinking of God, seeking his face, using ultimately this beautiful expression from the psalmist, I seek your face, Lord, your face will I seek. When we're talking about finding God in prayer, we could mean prayer in lots of different ways. And so I take this also as a chance to introduce my students to the idea of contemplative prayer, mental prayer. And it's not just a matter of prayer, it's actually a really important feature of how we think about anything. Contemplation is a difficult act of the mind to teach someone, to explain to someone. But really, you don't have a good education until people have shown you what this is and oriented your education toward helping you contemplate. It's very difficult to break through just using metaphors for it, of seeing it. It tends to break down into, just think about it, man. But what we want to do here is hold the object in the intellect, marvel at it, wonder at it, look at it in some mental sense. And that act of interior mental prayer, of thinking only of God and somehow seeing him, this is what we mean by contemplation. Now, at the end of the paragraph, we do get this indication that God needs to teach us how to do it. It's not obvious. Otherwise, we'd always be seeing the face of God in the inner chamber of our minds. And that's going to introduce us to the problem, or the series of problems. This paragraph makes it sound like the world is the problem for praying to God, but paragraph 2 makes things a little more complicated. Here we once again have things drawn up so that you can see our key idea in the center of the paragraph, anxiety and exile. And what comes before it and what comes after it sort of revolve around this idea. We're going to state a problem in the first half with that series of rhetorical questions. And then in the second half, we're going to talk about why it's a problem. And altogether, that sums up to this problem of anxiety. It's an existential reflection on our state as humans, why we as humans, all of us, are exiles and have an anxiety or are disturbed in our daily lives. This is a meaning of life paragraph. The rhetorical questions it's important to get the tone, I think. Anselm is essentially asking how to find God and then proposing answers to that question, how we should go about doing it, and then sort of rejecting them as not working. So if you're not here, because I have to seek you, well, where are you then? Well, I hear God is everywhere. That's a thing you hear. Maybe we'll need to come talk about that in our natural theology in a bit, but isn't God everywhere? Well, if God's everywhere, then it should be very easy to find him, shouldn't it? And that doesn't appear to be the case. Then, relying on, or really just quoting, I guess, 1 Timothy, the first letter of St. Timothy, and also I think an allusion here to the Epistle of St. James as well from the New Testament, we say that God he dwells in unapproachable light. Okay, well, where's that? And if it's unapproachable, how do I approach it? And who can show me how? How do you go into that light and see God in unapproachable light? How does that work? There's a growing frustration in the questions. The funniest one, I think, is by what marks or under what form shall I seek you? Fundamentally, what does God look like? How will I know when I've found him? If I've never seen you, what if no one's ever seen him? And this is a good introduction to what we're going to be doing over the next couple of months. One of the strengths, I think, of this reading as an introduction is that it serves as a nice table of contents for all of our major doctrinal issues with trying to do the high doctrine in Catholic tradition. So God doesn't look like anything. That's not something we've established yet, but God doesn't have a face. God doesn't have a form or a figure to see. He's not the kind of thing that can be seen. So this first obstacle, I guess, if the world is the first obstacle, this more fundamental obstacle is that God isn't the kind of thing that can be seen at all. He's invisible. His own divine nature is a problem. We can't see it. Why, though, does that make us anxious? Why does that make us exiles? Now we have to look at the second half of the paragraph. We have a desire to see God. Notice that Anselm switches from first-person pronouns to third-person pronouns at the midpoint of the paragraph. So he begins with I. He's very much following St. Augustine's style here. He's a big St. Augustine fanboy. But in transitioning to the exile language and switching to the pronoun he, in part, he's now making statements universally about humans, any human. He's claiming that all humans pant to see God, long to come to God, are eager to find him, desire to seek him. So we again see the quadruplet, although in this case now we have verb complements, right, instead of nouns. There's this desire for God that we all have. Well, there's lots of things we desire and can't do, and we just give up. So why instead do we not give up? Why are we anxious? Why are we exiles? And that brings us to the very last line, which I've got bolded and italicized there. We're made to see God. So the desire is very powerful, and it's, in a sense, undeniable or unforsakable because it's rooted directly in our nature. We're going to be talking about this a lot. We're going to end the year on this point, actually, the academic year. I was created to see you, and not yet have I done that for which I was made. The anxiety comes from knowing, being aware that there is a futility in us, that we can't do the thing that we're made to do, and we're aware of that. That's why we're anxious. That's why we're exiles, although maybe we haven't justified the exile language yet. Maybe that's just poetic. We're going to come back to that later. But it is also worth mentioning that there is a strange paradox here, and this we'll tackle repeatedly as the year goes on. Anselm is claiming we are made to see God who cannot be seen. That's a very strange paradox in our nature. The purpose for which we are created is impossible. That's pretty weird. So obviously something's going to have to give there, and that's partially what this reading is about, and partially what all of Catholic theology is about. From here we move on to pursue how things are now compared to how things began. That it wasn't always this way. This exile state or this anxiety, it isn't the way we started. We weren't made this way. He's pretty obviously, if you have any background knowledge of Christianity at all, you know that he's talking about Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, the fall of man, original sin in these next few paragraphs. But Anselm doesn't actually make that explicit, and I try to keep that vague with my students for now because I haven't taught it to them yet. We're going to get to it. But it's very easy to get the sense of what he's doing here if you do have that background information. Paragraph 3, after the vi introduction, is you're really beat over the head with a repetitive structure. Every sentence, with one exception, is built the same way. We are contrasting two states: a prior state of happiness, once upon a time, and our present state of sorrow. I've only shown the first few of these. In fact, I picked the first 4 with the underlining and the italicizing. What has he lost? What has he found? What has departed? What remains? But you could do that with every sentence, with again, one exception. And that's a good exercise for you guys as students, for the reader. Follow that path to the end and see if they all make sense, see if you understand them. There are a couple of unusual words here if you're a younger reader, but easy to look up on the internet. So as soon as you pick up with man wants to eat the bread of angels, you can immediately start doing the underlining and the italicizing. It didn't always used to be this way. At the core of this paragraph is the idea, is this beautiful sentence: alas for the mourning of all mankind, for the universal lamentation of the sons of Hades. It's terrific. I do take time to make my students explain this one a little bit carefully. Very common student mistake. I think it's a mistake. I'll argue that it's a mistake to interpret Hades here as hell or the devil. And therefore, we're talking about our eternal punishment for our sins somehow. And really, the notion of sin has not shown up yet, except maybe by implication with whatever it is that caused the loss. But we haven't really talked about evil things that we do. We're really just talking about an unhappy condition. And so I force my students to think a little more seriously about what Hades means for the Greeks in the Greek religious tradition. It is true that In later Christian art, we sort of repurpose Hades and do use Hades sometimes as a way of talking about hell. Certainly in the Septuagint we do. But I think that Anselm, again, because he's following St. Augustine, really does mean the classical illusion here. I mean, actually, I think he means it at two levels. First of all, Hades isn't hell for the Greeks. Hades is just, at least in one sense, the realm of the dead. It's where you go when you die. Or it's the guy that rules over all of that. Hades isn't the villain for the Greeks. They're afraid of him because they don't want to die. But we're the ones that make all the movies where Hades is the bad guy or the villain. The Greek version of the devil. That's not really right. Hades is just death. So in the simpler Greek sense, St. Anselm is just saying that we're all dead. We're dead right now. The state we're in now of present sorrow, when you contrast it with our prior state of happiness, can best be described as a state of death. Or, as my students sometimes like to propose, we're going to die. We're bound for death. And that's true. Anselm would agree. But I don't think that's what he means here. I think he really means that we are dead. Now, if I could peel the onion back one more layer, I would also like to connect this with my first reading that I give my students every year. This one requires a little bit more argument, but if you look at Hades, both the god and the place, the realm, it's even more basic, maybe if we demythologize it a little bit, it's even more basic than death or afterlife. Just like his brothers rule the sky and the sea, Zeus the sky and Poseidon the sea, Hades rules the ground. It's just the ground. Where do you go when you die? Well, you fall down on the ground and you rot away into the dirt, or we bury you, or we burn you. So Hades is just the earth, or under the earth. That's why the Ceres and Persephone stories are connected with Hades, because stuff grows out of the ground. So another way to read this is that in our present state, we are buried under the earth. We are trapped underground, cut off from this prior state, which, if I steal from the future in this chapter, would say we were in the light and now we're trapped under the earth. And I think there's a really important classical allusion there that I will pursue when we get a little bit farther in. But it relates to the first reading that I have my students do before we do Proslogion 1. The other big thing to say about this paragraph, I know we're dwelling on it quite a bit, is that, again, we should follow the pronouns. And in this case, notice that Anselm is contrasting he with he at first. And then as the paragraph goes on, he's contrasting he with we. And that's going to carry on into chapter 4. Paragraph 4. Both of these paragraphs together, paragraphs 3 and 4, are a little ambiguous about who we mean by he. Not too dissimilar from what was happening in paragraph 2 when we made the transition from I to he. And this is, as I teach my students, as I teach you guys every year, this is not a mistake. This is a feature. We're really following the way the Catholic tradition has always talked, following St. Paul, really, in the letter to the Romans and elsewhere, of talking about humanity or humans. Sometimes when we say he or man or human, we mean human nature, mankind, as he says there on the page. Sometimes we mean every one of us individually. And sometimes we mean the first human. So Adam, if you know the story of creation in Genesis. And very importantly, we really mean all of them simultaneously. You have to realize that thinking of the human race as a single subject stretched through time, and as all of us collectively as individuals, which is, I think, the more natural way for us to think about it today, as well as all of us in this one person, Adam, who lived at a certain time at the beginning, whenever that was. That's really common in all of our authors, and it's very common in St. Anselm's writing, and it's very important in Cur Deus Homo, which we're going to read later in the year. And that's an important feature to keep track of. Now we do focus on that first human in paragraph 4. Every year, when I ask my students who is the he in paragraphs 3 and 4, Sometimes they'll say God or the devil, and it's because of these first sentences here. Why did he not keep for us when he could so easily? Because we're talking about this he shutting us away from the light and covering us over with darkness, my students go to the idea that it's God or the devil doing it. And it's in fact just us. It's Adam. It's the first human. Anselm, again, is skirting around saying Adam, and he doesn't indicate even that it's the first human. But that's clearly what he's going for. Some human, the first one, failed. He did this to us. So it's not just that we have knowledge of these two states, the prior state and the present state, what we're made for, and and how we've ended up so far. But now we can also point to a specific thing, that we ourselves in Adam robbed us of life and inflicted death upon us. And now we're going to get to why he used exile language in paragraph 2. I think that we have a clearly beautiful allusion to the opening of the Aeneid in these questions that follow. This is Juno dashing Aeneas on the waves and setting Aeolus loose. This is the native country into exile. We're leaving Troy and on our long voyage of trying to escape exile. The vision of God into our present blindness. I mean, I'll throw Anchises in there while we're at it, I guess. We can run in a lot of directions with it, but I think we've got another nice classical allusion here. And now it's clear that we are exiles. We were once able to see God in some way, although Anselm is playing a little fast and loose with some important dogma there, which we'll get back to later. And now we can't. Now we no longer enjoy that divine intimacy. Now we no longer have the capacity to enter into the inner chamber of the mind and see God somehow. And it's because of the sin of Adam. And we end with another set of exclamations of sorrow. Paragraph 5 has in its core, and really the core is the only part I want to focus on here, a really obvious allusion to the first paragraph. It takes us all the way back to the beginning. We've been building to this point in paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. And now we're going to say, well, when I enter into the inner chamber of the mind, I find sighs, I find confusion, I stumble on myself. I sought calm and privacy, and I found tribulation and grief in my inmost thoughts. And I've just put the key line from paragraph 1 up here beside it, because the realization in paragraph 5 is that the turmoil of the world that we're supposed to block out, it's in us too. And it's in us precisely because of the sin of Adam and whatever it is that lost us. That prior state of happiness. So the thing that Anselm encourages us or exhorts us to do in paragraph 1 is impossible. Obviously, we're talking about the doctrine of original sin here. If you have any knowledge of that, it's very clear. But again, Anselm doesn't say it. We do get a reference to Eve, so we know we have our first real explicit clue that we're talking about Adam. And we're going to come talk about this later, the doctrine of original sin. For now, I only want to talk about it in terms of the way it's written in this chapter. And it is that the brokenness or the obstacles, I guess, that we find around us in the world and that we find around us as a result of the sin of Adam are also inside of us. So in a sense, there is no inner chamber of the mind, or the inner chamber of the mind is broken. And so we can't even take the first step to see God that Anselm proposes at the beginning of the reading. Distressing. We could summarize then all of the early paragraphs as naming 4 obstacles. I've just said them. Here we are as a nice summary slide. We have the world itself, which is this source of distraction and separation. We have God's own divine nature. He's not the kind of thing that can be seen. In paragraph 2, we have the sin of Adam, and we have original sin, in here in scare quotes, to describe the way the sin of Adam affects us interiorly, internally. Our own minds are damaged goods. So how are we going to do the thing we were made to do? Well, we need help. And that is what chapter 6, or paragraph 6 rather, is about. Quite a bit of the text here is Anselm stringing together quotations from the Psalms, all the usque quo and all the rest here, the iniquities going over our heads and being bowed down to the earth. These are all famous expressions from the Old Testament. Notice that when Anselm asks God for help in that first, red boxed section, he's not asking if God can help. He's very confident that God can do something about it. So, how long will God forget us? When will you fix this? When will you enlighten us? When will you restore? Not if or can, but when will it happen? And then we get these commands. And when we gather up all of the verbs here, and when you see them in contrast to the previous 5 paragraphs, it's clear that we are suffering, humans are suffering a grave injury as exiles, anxious, futile, unable to do what we are made to do, and therefore sorrowful, miserable. And Anselm is asking God to do good, to help, to fix it. This is how we're going to define mercy. This is what mercy means. The word mercy means to do good to the suffering. And so a very simple way to summarize what's going on in paragraph 6 is the idea that that Anselm asks God to show mercy. But what is the mercy that he asks for? We're going to build to that through the rest of this paragraph, and then it's going to be revealed in paragraph 7. The way he asks for it to be resolved is quite strange. So all of the unboxed material in the middle, and again, we've got this central idea with everything else revolving around it. He's talking about not losing hope and being able to go on breathing and having our desolation sweetened, right, with consolation. But that, all of which makes sense. I'm miserable, make me happy, right? But in fact, the way he asks it to be fixed is not as simple as make it all go away. Well, just, let us see you, just fix it all at once, like this. Instead, we don't want to lose hope. We want to be able to go on. We want the strength to continue to seek. So he even explicitly says, quite strangely, in hunger I seek you, may I not cease to hunger for you. I mean, if you're hungry, it seems like the solution is, make me not hungry, give me food. But Anselm asks for only enough to go on, some sort of partial fix. And this partial fix is important for what we're going to say in the next paragraph. And then some very famous, beautiful language about coming in poverty to the rich and in misery to the compassionate. And now again to the pit and being stuck, buried in the ground, looking up toward the light. I think this is a reference to Plato's allegory of the cave. This is a religious, obviously Catholic take on what the prisoners in the cave are experiencing. We are trapped in the cave, just like when when Socrates is talking with Glaucon in the Republic. And so it's, I think, mediated through St. Augustine. We have a Platonic or a particularly Catholic interpretation of Plato. And I ask my students, the people watching this video, to write a comparison paper between what Anselm is talking about in Proslogion chapter 1 and all the ways that he talks about humans and the goal of the meaning of life and their goal, and the prisoners in the cave and the man who escapes in the cave and how that story ends. How do the stories begin? How do they end? And I think there's a lot of instructive parallels between the two, which I will, of course, not lecture on right now because I want my students to write about them. Now, this being able to look up to the light, even from afar, even from the depths, at the beginning of paragraph 7, this is our starter definition for the word faith. Obviously, my students come to this class with a lot of baggage about what the word means, and we will piece through all of that. We'll pick our way through all the different ways we can mean the word faith over the course of this first semester. But to start the year with our first properly theological text, I want to start with the way Anselm talks about faith. It is a way of beginning to see God from afar, of beginning to fix the problem that Anselm has been describing throughout these paragraphs in this chapter. We'll say more, and we'll do technical stuff, and we'll look at Aquinas' definition, and we'll look at the Catechism and the way it talks about. We'll look at lots of different things. But this is a really good starting point. We're made to see God, and we can't, and it makes us miserable. And in order to do the thing we're made to do, Faith is the thing that Anselm asks for. Faith is the thing that God gives us to begin to do that, to carry on, to be able to actually see God and be with God. In the middle, we talk again about what we are created for. And whereas before he talked about it in terms of seeing God, now he's a little more explicit, that you have created me in this your image in order that I may be mindful of you, may conceive of you, and love you. We believe through the act of faith, as it's the beginning of our knowledge of God, which culminates in the love of God. And that's our happy ending. That's the meaning of life. Now we do finally get, for the first time in the paragraph, or in the chapter rather, we do finally start to talk about sins. We actually said a little bit with the pit of iniquity in paragraph 6. But now it's much clearer. The image of God in us has been consumed and wasted away by vice. We're going back and talking a little bit about the effects of sin, original sin, paragraphs 3, 4, 5. But even aside from that, even aside from the way in which we are crippled by sin, which we'll get around to talking about eventually, faith is not our complete knowledge of God. Faith does not remove the problem of seeing God. It's not the snap of the fingers and now, yes, we see him. It begins to fix it. We believe so that we can begin to understand, so that we can have a life of pursuing understanding. In the Catholic tradition, faith is not the final answer to everything. It is what makes it possible for us to grow in understanding of God and eventually to see God. No one in heaven, no one, has faith in God. Doesn't need it. You don't need it. As we say, faith gives way to sight. It's remedial. Faith is perfected in heaven. It becomes vision. Now you really do see God directly in a way that not even Adam did, which is the way that Anselm was being a little fast and loose with what Adam could do or what we used to be able to do long before. We'll cover that stuff later. We don't need to cover that today. But this final line, I do not seek to understand so that I can say, yes, now I believe it. Because faith is not the affirmation of, yes, I think that's true. Faith is this ability that we are given somehow by God to see him from afar, partially. And so we get this, as I say in summarizing these paragraphs, faith partially restores the vision of God lost in the fall, without which we cannot be happy. That's the one sentence summary of this entire chapter. Faith partially restores the vision of God lost in the fall, without which we cannot be happy. It is the beginning of our knowing and loving God, which will only be perfected after death. But all of that's down the road. We're going to teach all of those things as the year goes on. That's all I want to say about these paragraphs for now. We could go on, we could say more, but this is meant to just get you guys through the basics and help you write your paper this weekend. So if you have any questions about all of this, as usual, feel free to reach out. You know how to get a hold of me, either in the comments down below or on all the other websites where we interact. And until the next time, until class, good luck, God bless.